We mentioned MVC stands for Model View Controller, and we've seen the model and view folders already. So where's the controllers folder? Well, in ColdBox, it's actually named handlers, but everything in the handlers folder is the same as what would go in a controllers folder in other MVC frameworks. It's only called handlers because the Java-based frameworks that helped to inspire ColdBox used the term handlers, so that name was used in ColdBox too. The handlers folder pretty much just has CFCs in it. The methods in the CFCs are the names of different events in your application, and that's how ColdBox does pretty much everything. See how we're on the /main page in our browser? Let's look at the handlers folder in our editor. There's a main.cfc file, and that corresponds with the /main part of the URL. And in that CFC, we're running the index method you can see at the top of the screen. This is the default method in a CFC. If we don't specify anything else in the URL, just the /main part, it will automatically run the index method located in that CFC handler. If I went to a URL like, say, /main/getUsers, then ColdBox would still look in the main CFC, but instead of running the index method, it would look for another method called getUsers, and it would run that one instead. You don't have to configure anything to make the URLs match up with the methods in CFCs. As long as you're consistent with the naming conventions, everything just magically works. By default, the handlers will live in the /handlers directory, but you can change that in the config CFC file if you so choose. Usually I just leave it alone. Every method in your handler CFCs will receive 3 arguments: event, RC, and PRC. RC and PRC we've already discussed. Those are where your data gets stored. RC is the request collection, and it's for anything provided by the user, basically your URL and form variables, things like that. PRC is the private request collection. This is for all the other data that your app will use. For example, if you have a select query and the rows need to be passed to the view page so that they can be drawn on the screen, you do that by putting the query in the PRC scope. Technically, you could put it in the RC scope as well. You can put any data you want in the RC scope, but the best practice is to keep that data that came from the user separate from everything else. The other argument your handlers receive is the event object. This is kind of a kitchen sink object, if you will, for your handlers. It includes a variety of methods that are useful for manipulating data in your handler, whether it's in the RC or PRC scopes. Now we're going to use the write_dump method and just output the event object to the screen so you can take a look at what's inside it. Here's a snapshot of everything you can see in the event object. If it seems overwhelming, don't worry. These are all for things like setting and retrieving your variables, checking to see if we're using AJAX or SES URLs, formatting the output in your handler. You might use these methods, or you might not need them at all. The event object also includes a copy of the RC and PRC scopes inside it, so technically, you could just pass the event object to your handler methods, rather than all 3 arguments, RC, PRC, and event, but for ease of use, RC and PRC get broken out and passed in as their own parameters. Okay, so how are these events called? There are a few different ways, but the basic answer is you'd call these events just like there were any other URL in your web app, meaning you could type the URL into an event in your browser, and we've seen a few examples of that already, or you could do a form post to a handler, just like you would do a form post to a particular URL with the form tag in your HTML output. Or say, if you're using a JavaScript framework like Angular or React, you could call the URL for a handler from inside one of those applications. You could even have one event call another event from inside itself. We'll look into some of that a little bit later on in this video series. In an earlier video, we saw the router CFC file and how you can use various combinations of the route methods and some helper functions to map different URLs over 2 different events. There were also those various methods toResource, toRedirect, and so on. Notice the method at the very bottom of our router CFC file, right here. It's right there in the naming convention. Any URL in this format will match up to an event handler and the action method inside it. We can also use these route placeholders or named routes like we saw before, and we can combine those with various to methods, toResource, toRedirect, and point those to whatever event handlers we want to run. So you can have a URL that literally says event equals handler.action, or you can use the SES shorter version of that URL. You can customize things even farther like we saw in a previous video, and much more. At the end of all these different ways, there will always be your event handler invoking some function inside it and executing the corresponding code. You'll see handlers used all over your ColdBox applications. Remember, handlers are just called controllers in other MVC frameworks, and they really are the place that controls how all of your application behaves. For the most part, all you need is this one route line that we have at the bottom of our router CFC file with the handler/action naming convention. And that, by default, maps up with anything in your handlers folder. You can see I have a users handler with list and details actions inside it. Those would map up to a URL, sitename.com/users/list or details and so on. And you can use that same convention for any handler in your handlers folder here in your Coldbox application. You don't have to do any of the customization that we have up here. These are just for examples showing you some of the extra flexibility you have with the router CFC file if you'd like to use that in your applications as well.